Hello, and welcome to the Local Voices Making Local Choices workshop. We're glad you're here. In the age of COVID-19, polls consistently show that the public trusts local government leaders much more than state legislators or members of Congress. So why are cities and counties always having to defend themselves from attempts to limit home rule authority? In this session, we'll hear from a number of policy experts. First, Ted Baggett, Director of Local Government Services at the Carl Vinson Institute of Government. And we're also joined today by mayors throughout the state to tell us what home rule means to them and why local voices are really the best to make local choices.
We must realize that local elected leaders have the best vantage point because we're closest to the people.
I certainly think we have created pride in place through home rule because people feel like they're heard, they have a voice, and that things get done.
Greetings, virtual GMA convention attendees. I'm Ted Baggett, Associate Director of the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, here to talk about home rule for cities in Georgia. First off, what's home rule? Home rule is a legal term that we use to describe the measure of autonomy that local governments have to act. Most states adopted some official form of home rule for local governments in their state constitutions during the 1950s and 60s. The National League of Cities made this major push at the time out of an effort to push back against Dillon's Rule. Dillon's Rule is the legal principle articulated in an Iowa Supreme Court case that holds that local governments can only act pursuant to very specific grants of power from the state that must be narrowly construed. Home rule for cities in Georgia is unique in that some of it is found in the state constitution and some of it is provided by statute. Many of the constitutional home rule powers can be found in Article 9, Section 2 of the state constitution. Many of the statutory powers come from the Municipal Home Rule Act of 1965. Various other state laws and court cases have been held to grant power to local governments in Georgia. As one might expect, constitutional grants of authority are much harder to amend than those provided merely by statute. The Supplementary Powers Clause of the state constitution grants the authority to cities to provide a host of services. While the state legislature can regulate these powers, they can't withdraw them. Other constitutional powers include the authority to zone property, the ability to condemn property, and the ability to create special service districts. The Home Rule Act primarily grants authority to cities to exercise control over their own internal affairs and to govern their relationships with their employees. So where is home rule authority most challenged? Through preemption from state government. The state legislature has broad powers to adopt legislation regulating private sector activities in ways that forecloses on local government's ability to do so. This can be directly preemptive, or preemption can be implied. State agencies adopting rules pursuant to a state statute can administer rules in ways that frustrate local regulation. In addition, the governor has broad emergency powers that can be used to preempt local governments as he or she sees fit. To sum up, Georgia cities enjoy broad home rule powers to provide services and regulate land use. They enjoy statutory powers over their own operations and employees that are slightly more susceptible to being amended by the state because they aren't constitutional in stature. Finally, the primary tension between the state and local governments lies in the realm of regulating private sector behavior. State government maintains the ability to preempt local regulations whenever it sees fit. This pattern is not uncommon across the country and is a constant source of policy debate.
Our representatives are doing an outstanding job of understanding that there are people at the core of every decision we make. And sometimes when we're talking about big pots of money and moving things around in different programs, that it's really at its core, it's about people. It's about improving the lives of the citizens in our communities.
Being mayor, there's opportunities to solve problems that people have. And typically those problems are not overwhelming. And the satisfaction that I get in solving those problems and helping people out and providing them the services that they're actually paying for.
We'll now hear from Kim Hadow, the Director of Local Solution Support Center, our own Tom Gale, Director of Governmental Relations here at GMA, and Nestor Davidson, Professor at Fordham University School of Law.
we are going to start with a look at why this is such a timely conversation. Bottom line is that and Nestor will go more into this, but it's been almost 70 years since we have really thought through how to reframe home rule, the local authority, the authority that localities have to act and the powers they have. And so frankly, we think there are two core reasons that we need to update home rule. One of them is, frankly, cities have outgrown the existing framework. I think that you guys all know there's been a lot of changes in cities in the last 7 decades. And frankly, we need a home rule that meets the demands of today and tomorrow. If you look at what challenges cities are facing, including equity, climate change, pandemics, technology, the very important role in advancing solutions, innovations. Frankly, the framework that exists now, the structure that exists now is not adequate. It just doesn't work. Then what we also see is there has been, and you guys understand this very well, you're on the front lines of this, this use of or misuse of preemption, and what has been happening over the last decade particularly is this increase in the use of state preemption to really limit the authority and autonomy of cities and really disable their ability to act on the needs and views and values of their local citizens. It's been quite deliberate and it has been very targeted, and in some cases it's been very punitive. And so this combination of cities need to be able to do more, and at a time when they need to be able to do more, states are actively looking to limit their ability to do more. That is why we are looking for a structural fix to really part of what is a structural problem. Looking at how the power of cities and the balance of power between cities and states changes session after session, on issue after issue. This has been up to now a very siloed discussion. And we think it's time to look at it in a much broader, more fulsome way. Basically, we're just going to take a quick look at where cities are now as opposed to where they were in 1953 when the last update of home rule was done. But then about a little less than half Americans lived in cities. Today, over 80% of Americans live in cities. So this is where most Americans live. They live in their cities. Cities are now dramatically more racially and ethnically diverse. Their needs are different. And frankly, their role in economies have changed dramatically. So cities are now the drivers of state and national and often global economies. I mean, if you look at New York and San Francisco and their roles in their respective financial and technological worlds, they're the drivers in the world. So they need a lot more authority than they have. Okay, and frankly, as you guys well know, local governments are on the front lines meeting local needs and responding to local values. So if you look at, as we're seeing right now play out with the coronavirus, front lines of public health and safety, wages and employment, climate change and environmental protection, fair and affordable housing, technology, civil rights, and anti-discrimination. These were not all things that cities did 70 years ago. What we have seen, and this is a very stark way of showing this, but what we have seen is that since 2011, the legislative sessions after the 2010 midterms, when basically Republicans took over with a very deliberate plan called Red Map, many state legislatures in a hope of affecting redistricting. We have seen a huge, huge increase in the use of state preemption. Particularly, and I tried to pick a cross-issue look at this. So you have everything from minimum wage to short-term rentals here to fair scheduling to paid sick days. And you can see that basically these huge spikes going up, particularly in 15, 16, and 17, where this has become a go-to strategy in states that really want to restrict the use of the implementation of these kind of policies. So just digging in a little more on not only has the use skyrocketed, but across a number of states happening all at the same time, or pretty sequentially. You have 25 states that now preempt local minimum wage laws, 23 states that ban local paid sick days laws, 33 states that prohibit equitable housing policies, 42 states that have tax and expenditure limits, which are going to be very important, as we all know, in the recovery from the pandemic, and 19 states that ban municipal broadband. So as you can see, it's a large number, it's more frequently used, and it's across a broad number of policy issues. So this new preemption, and we call it new preemption because I think you all know this is not your grandfather's preemption. I mean, preemption's been around for a long time, usually used to set a minimum floor of standards and that cities and localities can build upon. That's not what we're seeing now. Frankly, we're seeing what we call Death Star deregulation. This is where states are wiping out 7, 8, 9 policies all at once, meaning that cities can't regulate on minimum wage and fair scheduling and ban the box. And there are lots of things that are being wiped out all at once. Then we have blanket deregulation, which is really looking at removing localities' ability to regulate business altogether. We see this particularly in Florida and Arizona, in some places where it is, you can't, businesses cannot enforce law, any kind of regulation against business, and trying to wipe out that regulatory authority in one fell swoop. We do see punishments included in this new preemption, usually in 2 forms. One of them directed at cities, which means a cutoff of state funds, or you either lose state revenue sharing funds, or frankly, cities have lost their place in line when they're going for infrastructure improvements. They suddenly are out of the queue when it comes to bridges or repairs or that kind of funding. The other thing is, even more insidious, is punishment directed at local officials. So this opens up local officials for lawsuits, criminal activity in some places, removal from office, very targeted, and frankly, very new. We are also learning that this new preemption has a disproportionate effect on women and people of color. So when you think back at that chart I just showed you about the policies that are being preempted, you're looking at minimum wage, you're looking at paid sick days, you're looking at broadband, you're looking at things where people of color and women are the most in need of these policies, and yet they are not getting them, and they are the folks who are most affected by the lack of this kind of policy remedy. We're also seeing increasingly a targeting of core local functions by the states. So we have states who are now, my dog, states who are now trying to figure out when actually localities can run their own elections, or how much to pay local officials, or in some cases, we have been tracking with this new form, which is eliminating municipal litigation. So limiting how cities can bring lawsuits against opioid manufacturers or the oil and gas companies, anything that might hold industry liable. So all of these core local functions, elections, contracting, litigation, we are seeing hollowed out and carved away. And then finally, I mean, the most long-term effect has been the use of preemption to chill advances in policy and new innovations. Because, I mean, we get this call all the time at the LSSC. Would this be preempted if I went ahead of it? Would I be triggering some sort of state action if I introduced this bill, or if we took this action? And unfortunately, that means local lawmakers are pulling back on things that might actually be very smart and wise to implement. So just taking a quick look at COVID and preemption. So this is how cities are starting from behind, because these preemptions are already in place going into the response mode, and where cities are being called on, as Mayor Williams said, to be on the front line of keeping their people safe and making sure that services are delivered. So we see that the paid sick days, particularly equitable housing policies, broadband particularly, have had an effect on the ability of cities to help their residents respond. We're also very concerned about the preemption of minimum wage and taxing and expenditure authority as we go forward on the recovery, right? How is it if people have no money? How is it if cities have no money? And I know you all are thinking very hard and deep about that. So what we are seeing is I think, and you guys know this very well, and Tom is going to go much more deeply into this. So I'm just going to say you're not alone in experiencing this. But, the executive orders that have been given out at the states include explicit preemption in many cases. So, this is just some language that are included in the orders, but we're seeing Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Iowa, Arizona, Arkansas, South Carolina, Texas. Bottom line is, these are all executive orders that include very explicit preemption. You know, the rare case is like North Carolina, where the governor there said this in no way, this establishes a floor and in no way prohibits localities from taking additional action that would save the lives of their residents and protect their safety. But in most cases, I know you notice it's particularly in the South, we are seeing very explicit preemption in these executive orders. So just a little bit about us, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and thank you for your time.
I'm really glad to see that there weren't many Georgia preemptions on that chart that you shared, Kim. Just the paid leave and the minimum wage preemption, and both of those occurred in one of my first years working at GMA, nearly 20 years, around 20 years ago. It was due to discussions at one city, the city of Atlanta, about requiring that companies that do business with the city of Atlanta, particularly Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, have certain types of policies related to fair wages and health care. And immediately the Metro Chamber, Delta Airlines, and other big companies that had contracts at the airport went to the state legislature. And within weeks, all of the cities in the state were preempted from minimum wage and other types of fair wage practices. So I wanted to start off with this photo of us at the state capitol with our home rule banners. It was a triumphant day to show members of the General Assembly that we really cared about home rule and about cities united. But one thing we need to keep in mind, we've been fighting against preemptions since 1933 when GMA was created, and preemptions, in a sense, are, especially for the lobbying team, are full employment for us, because we know that every year there's going to be a preemption bill or multiple preemptions bills that we have to deal with. So again, for Nestor and Kim's benefit, the composition of the General Assembly, we are getting more purple in Georgia, and the House has 180 representatives, 105 are Republicans and 75 are Democrats. When the Republicans swung the state in the House, the margin was even wider at the time when the Democrats controlled. So there's a lot of discussion and buzz among the Democratic Party, particularly House races, that there's a chance that they may capture enough seats for the House to go Democratic. I'm skeptical, but you never know in this crazy environment of COVID-19. The Senate's more safely Republican, but it's also becoming a little bit more purple with a couple of recent losses by Republican senators. So we've got a bunch of committees down at the state capitol, but the main ones that we deal with and have to work with are governmental affairs, SLOGO, state and local government, and then a number of other committees that we deal with that often have bills to preempt us. And one in particular that's notorious for preempting us is the House Agriculture Committee. Believe it or not, when they want to preempt municipal governments, the best place to start is agriculture. So what we do is try to maintain constant communication between our Legislative Policy Council, chaired by Mayor Williams, our city officials. We do direct targeted mailings, emails. We use social media. And we really rely on a lot of local government champions, former city officials, former county officials who are now in the General Assembly to help us. And of course, we have our perennial partners who we oftentimes have to pull along into these fights with us, the Association of County Governments. So we've had a major fight for the past 3 years, and it's a proposal to preempt residential building design standards. It's a national effort. Model bills have been pushed out in other states. I know Kim and Nestor, you all have been following these. The DC-based Vinyl Siding Institute even has guidebooks on their website on how to message to either push reduction of residential building design standards locally or at the state level. It was introduced a couple of years ago, and they've been trying to build momentum ever since. It's recently been supported not only by the home builders and the Vinyl Siding Institute, but the Georgia Association of Realtors, the Georgia Chamber, and even the Metro Atlanta-based Council for Quality Growth has supported this legislation. And it would essentially remove all aesthetic design standards. And they are pushing this under the guise that a removal of local design standards will promote workforce housing. So what we did when we decided to fight this legislation is we said, well, we've got to have a message that's almost like bumper sticker in its quality, that because if we start getting into the weeds, we're going to lose our ability to influence those legislators on the fence. And so the key message was citizens, not special interests, should be making these local decisions unique to each part of the state. But we also talked about the sense of place, the ability to attract economic development and new residents dependent upon these standards. And we also talked about the ripple effect on historic areas, residential areas, covenanted neighborhoods with covenants. And that messaging was able to help us as we fought this negative proposal, ownership proposal. So our key strategies, we actually showed that local governments don't just have bureaucrats in a basement in City Hall doing these plans. They have a very comprehensive plan for how these standards should be rolled out in each community. They're all different, and I think we showed that this was a citizen-driven process, and that really carried the day with a lot of legislators. We also had a coalition with our county counterparts, historic preservation groups, even the architects were with us, and environmental groups. That was just one major example, but this past session, we also had to deal with short-term rental preemption. We had to deal with preemption on scooters and micromobility. We also had legislation that would have restricted our ability to control our municipal rights of way, particularly as it relates to charging for having utilities in our rights of way. Legislation was proposed to eliminate our franchise fee formulas and reconfigure how we're paid for being in our rights of way. There's legislation that would have banned non-taxed fees from being on property tax bills. And then the puppy mill industry is really upset at a number of local governments. I think there's probably 6 or 7 in Georgia that have prohibited retail sale of dogs and cats. And so that was another preemption we had to deal with. I do want to kind of end, and we can talk about this at the end, but messaging to support home rule. Citizens, not wealthy special interests, should be making local decisions unique to each part of the state. That resonates, but also one phrase that I've picked up and have been borrowing is, if you've seen one city, you've seen one city. They're all unique. And then I also like the Florida League of Cities, local voices making local choices. It's at the heart of everything we do. Cities, towns, and villages are more than places on a map. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Nestor.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, Larry, and thank you, Becky, for hosting us, and Holger for making this all happen. And I also want to thank Mayor Williams. You know, I'm not supposed to say I have favorite mayors. It's like when my kids ask me who's their favorite. But it has been terrific to get to know you, and I'm really excited about working with the Georgia Municipal Association. I have one of your blue home rule banners in my office, and it is quite a conversation starter. So thank you. I'm going to be brief because I really want to get to the conversation. So I'm going to talk about this new vision Kim and Tom have done a remarkable job laying out what's wrong with home rule today. Let me see if I can tell you some things that I'm optimistic about we can get better. So first of all, I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor, but let me just run through some technical structural failures from a legal perspective quickly. First, many states have parts of their states, or in some states, all of their states that don't have home rule. Dillon's rule is still the rule in a number of places. And even places that have home rule, there's been a long-term, really going back for 70 years, a reluctance on the part of the courts to embrace the authority that local governments are given as clearly as we think a lot of framers of home rule constitutional amendments intended. So there's a lot of ambiguity. And particularly over the last generation, the fiscal stability of local governments is under threat. When we go around the country, when Kim and I talk to municipal leagues and to mayors and to advocates, the fiscal threat that cities are under, that local governments are under, has become one of the defining issues in the state and local relationship. And so much of that has to do with constraints, from tax and expenditure limitation to unfunded mandates to other ways the state makes it hard for local governments to get the resources they need. Of course, I won't repeat everything you all know about preemption, but that's a critical problem we have to solve, not just in general, but particularly this rise of punitive preemption. So what are the consequences? I'll just be brief. We all know them. Chilling innovation. Kim talked about this. Serious threats to equity and our ability to advance social justice. And of course, at the end of the day, when local governments can't act, it undermines democracy, and it is a bar to all of the best of local community. So what is the structural response that we are proposing, that we are working with the National League of Cities and with other partners on to these structural problems? Well, the National League of Cities and Kim and others at LSSC brought together a group of law professors and other stakeholders. We spent the better part of more than a year convening and working on scope and reaching out, particularly to the leadership and staff of municipal leagues all over the country, to take a core set of ideas, refine them over time, come out with some deep research, capturing what is best about home rule, because it works in some places, or at least elements of it does, but of course, refinement around what could be made better. And the end result of that process, as Mayor Williams mentioned, is this Principles of Home Rule for the 21st Century, which we launched, which NLC launched with LSSC in February. So what are the principles? There are 4 core ideas we're building this vision around. First, we have to reinforce the breadth of local authorities. Local governments need the full range of the ability to make policy in all of the areas that they're grappling with. That was true before the coronavirus crisis. It is even more true today. Second, we need to pay particular attention to local fiscal authority. If local governments don't have the fiscal capacity to solve their problems, no amount of legal authority makes any difference. Third, we have to solve this problem of the runaway rise of preemption, of unreasonable preemption. Obviously, preemption has a role to play in creating uniformity where it's really important, but we think there should be a presumption. States should have to have a really strong reason for displacing local authority, and they should be prepared to defend that. And then finally, we think there should be protection for the kind of core of the core, for questions that communities make about how to resolve, how to govern themselves, how they elect their mayor, how they structure their personnel, all of those core internal self-governance mechanisms, we think in any vision of home rule should get the highest level of protection. And so hopefully you'll have a chance to look at the document. I'm happy to elaborate on any of these, but with apologies to my colleagues in academia, this is not an academic exercise. And so that's why we're so excited about this conversation. What we included, what the National League of Cities and LSSC included in this document, in this publication, is actually a model constitutional article and some deep commentary. And as Kim mentioned, the National League of Cities in 1953, it was then called the American Municipal Association, did the same thing. They promulgated a model constitutional article, and it proved to be incredibly influential. Almost every single reform to home rule in 2 or 3 decades after 1953 followed the what was then called the AMA model. I don't think we'll necessarily be quite so influential. We don't change our constitutions quite as often as we used to, but we do hope that this is at least a starting point for reform. So if you go through the document, you'll see that there are 5 articles. 1 reaffirms the principle that local self-government is a core part of state law. Judges have a hard time with that idea. They sort of default to state sovereignty. But we think what home rule means at the end of the day is that the people of the state get to decide who rules them. And whether that's local governments or states, it's up to the people to decide. Of course, we have a section that reinforces and expands and is clear about local authority, including local fiscal authority. We have a section that embodies what we mean by this presumption against preemption. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about any of these. We have a section that implements this idea of protecting the core about local democratic self-government. And then finally, we actually have a section that is part of the fiscal picture. But we think that if states are going to rely, as they do all over the country, on local governments to take care of some of the most important public services, whether it's safety and police and fire, or education, or any of the other array of very, very important public services that states look to locals to provide, we think states should have a responsibility to make sure, and this might take intergovernmental aid, there are lots of ways to structure this, but we think states have a corresponding obligation to make sure that local communities have the resources they need to meet those needs. And so where does that leave us moving forward in Georgia and beyond? Well, we want to hear from you. We want to engage in this conversation. We think that this new model and the legal language we've put together can fill a void, can create a new foundation for how states and local governments interact. We want to end these session by session. Now, I'm all in favor of a full employment act for lobbyists and lawyers. Don't get me wrong. I think of my students all the time going out into the employment market, but boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could avoid that. And so we would let local governments advance their work holistically and end these one-off battles. So really, we want to hear from you. We think that this is a compelling way of thinking about home rule, of talking about home rule, of beginning a conversation about law reform, but there's so many paths to bring this into reality. And so I look forward to your questions. I look forward to our dialogue, and I look forward to seeing how we can work with you on this. Thanks so much.
The pandemic has caused local officials to act fast. It is important that city leaders understand home rule principles and trends of local preemption efforts here in Georgia and around the country.
Even beyond kind of, I guess, political philosophy, which ends up being the debate between should things be centralized or home rule. The home rule argument is just more practical because of the proximity to the people being governed.
We'll now hear from Eric Zimmering, MPA Director and Associate Professor in the Department of Public Administration and Policy at the University of Georgia.
Hello, my name is Eric Zimmering. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Public Administration and Policy at the University of Georgia, where I'm also Director for the Masters of Public Administration program. Thanks for the invitation to talk with you about a survey that we had in the field in collaboration with the Georgia Municipal Association earlier this spring to better understand the city response to COVID-19 in Georgia. I'd like to share with you key findings from that survey and also chart out some unanswered questions that we still have as we reflect upon how our communities continue to respond to this unprecedented crisis. The SARS-CoV-2 virus and the COVID-19 disease drastically altered city government operations, not just in Georgia, but around the globe. In order to better understand how cities were adapting to the pandemic, we put a survey into the field from April 8 to April 22 to learn more about the city government response. From that survey, 41% of cities in the state responded, and that means we have very good insight into what local government action looks like in the state of Georgia. Our sample for the survey looks very much like the population as a whole, so we can be fairly confident that the results that I present with you here provide a pretty clear picture of what's going on in our state. 4 detailed reports were written to describe the survey data. You can access each of those 4 reports online by scanning the QR codes on this page with your smartphone camera, or you can find them online at medium.com. With this presentation, I'd like to go into more detail on 4 specific aspects of the report that I think deserve our continued reflection and discussion. First, most local governments did not have plans in place to respond to the pandemic. Second, cities are navigating internal workforce challenges related to the pandemic that require more attention and discussion. While much of our time has been spent considering the public health response or how local governments are interacting with their communities and external stakeholders, I think that we need to be more deliberate and focused on the implications of the pandemic for our city governments as organizations and workplaces. Third, state preemption is usually viewed very negatively by local governments, but in this case, the story is somewhat different, and I'd like to talk about why that might be the case. Fourth, many local governments view collaboration as important when they're responding to an emergency or a crisis. That appears true here, but we also see varying levels of collaboration across the state. Let me dive into each of these 4 points in more detail to suggest some paths for continued action across the state of Georgia. First, were pandemic plans in place? The survey reports that 77% of city governments said no, a written pandemic policy or a written pandemic response as part of an emergency response plan was not in place. Why is that surprising? Well, if we look to state emergency response guidelines, pandemic influenza is something included in state policy as an item that local emergency response plans should address or engage. So this gap, the 77% response rate indicating a lack of attention to the possibility of a pandemic, is somewhat surprising. Yet, if we look at earlier research that's been conducted in public administration, we see articles by Dr. French from Mississippi State University in 2008 and 2009 warning that too many local governments are unprepared for pandemic, specifically pointing to the lack of written pandemic response plans and the lack of deliberate conversations in the community about what actions a local government would need to take in the event of a pandemic. So this 77% should be a concerning number, but we did have warning, and we should have been better prepared to act. 13% of cities did have content in their emergency response plan related to pandemic, and 10% of cities had another written policy document outlining pandemic response. Now, we should probably consider another set of numbers that lends a little additional insight. When local governments were asked if local governments have an important role to play in pandemic response, 86% of cities either strongly agree or somewhat agree with that statement, suggesting that communities across the state believe that they need to take action and do work related to the pandemic. At the same time, 31% of cities either strongly agree or somewhat agree with the assertion that local governments or city governments should not have to take on a position of leadership in response to the pandemic. From that, I think that we need to conclude that local governments understand that there's work to do in this area, but certain portions of our local governments are looking to state and federal agencies to take the lead and point the direction in what's going on. Even with state and federal leadership, we probably need to take some significant steps in the years ahead to have more explicit written local government pandemic response plans within our communities. Referencing back to the work by Edward French published in Public Administration Review, we probably need to be aware that one area where we will need to continue conversation is the implementation and distribution of vaccines. Are local governments as communities and workforces ready to collaborate with state and federal actors on distribution plans? Do they know what the rationing or the allocation of vaccines across different groups might look like within their communities, and why that might be cause for strife or concern or disruption? So even though written response plans were not in place on March 2, local governments should still be taking quick action to pick up and develop written policies in this area to continue to respond to pandemic in the weeks and months ahead. Second, how did the local government workforce respond to the pandemic? Well, the answers to this question are nuanced and complex. 11% of the cities reported that their cities developed an internal task force to organize the city's response to pandemic. Some group of employees internally to coordinate action. 49% of cities reported that at least some employees were required to telework, and an even larger percentage of cities reported that there were time schedule alterations or schedule offsets to reduce the number of people in city facilities at any given time. Yet, we also find that 31% of cities provided computers or other equipment to support telework, and only 20% assisted employees with internet access to support telework. This suggests there may be a technological gap for some city employees in their ability to telework and work from home. We also know, something we did not ask about in the survey, that many local government employees are struggling as children return home from school, creating additional disruptions for our local government workforce. The technological capacity of our workforce to maintain telework over an extended period of time with additional disruptions in family obligations at home will need to have continued discussion as we think about flexible time and work arrangements. We also found from the survey that 13% of cities reported implementing some type of hazard pay for certain city employee groups, and 18% reported cross-training employees in anticipation of absences. Only 5% expanded on-site healthcare service, and 3% expanded counseling services for city employees. It's those last 3 bullet points on the screen that I'd encourage local government leaders to give more attention. If we anticipate that this pandemic will continue, as all the evidence suggests that it will in the months ahead, we'll probably have unplanned and unexpected absences from various segments of our workforce. Having employees cross-trained to pick up slack, to fill in where there are unanticipated gaps, may be very important. So if I were a manager in local government now, just as I am a low-level manager within the university, I'm thinking about how employee cross-training can help fill those gaps when unanticipated employee absences arise. So that's one key area where we can encourage attention and action by local government managers. Another perspective for you, the survey asked for levels of agreement to this question: my city has the necessary expertise on staff to respond to the outbreak. As you see from this distribution, there's a fair amount of uncertainty about this question. I think local governments feel uncertain about their preparation to respond to the pandemic because we don't know what skills or abilities we will need as a local government community to engage the various and complex needs arising from the pandemic. Certainly, some communities feel like they don't have the necessary public health capacity or the plans or the resources in place to respond to the pandemic. The Georgia Municipal Association was identified as a key information source in the survey, as well as some state and federal agencies. And I think that we should anticipate our local governments will continue to reach out for resources as we think about adapting to this new pandemic and this unprecedented crisis. The Carl Vinson Institute of Government at the University of Georgia has actively provided online webinars and resources to help local governments think about the financial implications of the pandemic, but the response to this question gives us some reason to believe that there's uncertainty about the skills and abilities that are needed inside City Hall to make sure our communities continue to cope with this crisis. Third, how did local governments react to state preemption? As I noted, local governments are often very critical about state removal of local government authority because it's viewed as an intrusion on the ability of communities to respond to local needs. Yet we see a very different response to Governor Kemp's statewide executive order requiring a shelter-in-place on April 3. That order preempted local ordinances and shelter-in-place provisions that were either more stringent or less stringent than the state guidelines in that executive order. As you see, many communities across the state, not a majority, but a large number, over 40%, viewed that preemption as extremely appropriate, with over 25% adding that it was somewhat appropriate. Only about somewhere on the measure of 12 or 13% described it as extremely inappropriate. What explains this distribution, particularly when local governments are often very concerned about state removing local government authority? Some of the qualitative comments gathered in the survey shed light on what's going on here. There's a concern by communities across the state that they're going to be taking actions to regulate local public health and behavior that are more stringent than their neighbors. And somehow their local communities, their residents, and their business communities will be at a disadvantage in comparison to their neighbors that adhere to weaker or less stringent public health standards. By adopting consistent regulations across the state, this may be one area in which state preemption is welcome because it removes that incentive or that potential ability for local governments to compete in stringency of public health initiatives and interventions. The state needs to be very aware of this finding in the days and weeks ahead, because the guidelines from the Georgia Department of Public Health and from our state leaders will probably carry significant weight in communities around the state, and the state may be looked to for additional leadership in the weeks ahead. We saw concern about this mounting again after that statewide shelter-in-place order was removed, and some communities began to chart out direction on their own. So the potential for statewide action or coherent state leadership may receive some level of endorsement going forward from communities, and this is an issue that we need to continue to give attention. Finally, did we see a higher level of collaboration within our communities in response to this crisis? Well, we might expect higher levels of intergovernmental coordination and collaboration with non-governmental organizations in the private sector, because local governments don't have the capacity to do everything they need to on their own. And 56% of city officials in Georgia strongly agreed with the statement, to respond to the pandemic, our city must collaborate with private and nonprofit organizations in the community. Specifically, we saw somewhat high levels of engagement with the local chambers of commerce, local medical doctors, and local hospital systems. And we also know that many local governments began working proactively with their business communities on a response to the economic fallout of the shelter-in-place orders and the shutdown of local economies. Yet, the city officials responding to the survey seem a little uncertain or concerned about the public response. 55% of city leaders described the public response to COVID-19 as somewhat or extremely adequate, while 24% of city officials expressed concern that the public response was somewhat or extremely inadequate. We often think about the general public as important in the co-production of public policy. That is, we need the public to cooperate to achieve certain public health goals related to the current crisis and pandemic. From the wearing of masks to social distancing to other provisions to keep our communities safe, local governments and state government agencies are trying to elicit public cooperation. And this signals that there's at least some local government concern that that local public buy-in might not be taking place. And while rhetorically we see a high level of endorsement for collaboration, give attention to these last 3 points on the screen. Only 6% of cities reported new contracts with nonprofit organizations to provide services. 14% reported the provision of emergency food service to the public, and only 4% reported emergency business relief funds during this early period of response. Now, we have anecdotal evidence that these resources and responses are increasing as time goes on, but that's a pretty concerning signal that in the early days of the pandemic, there was rhetorical support for collaboration, but many cities were still feeling their way into figuring out how will we work with our business community, and how will we work with our nonprofit community, how will we work with hospitals and medical organizations to support our residents and maintain a coherent public response. This is worth continued thought. And going back to an earlier screen, the idea of a task force within City Hall may be important at the community-wide level. The more collaboration and transparent conversations that take place between city governments and local community members, the more local governments may be able to leverage a collaborative response from the community to achieve shared public health and economic goals. So there's still more work to do when it comes to community level collaboration. Now, I want to thank you for your time listening to this presentation. Thank you if you invested in completing the survey to provide this insight to me, to GMA, and to other interested parties. As a local government official myself in the past, as a former city council member, I want to sincerely thank you for the work that you are doing at the local level. We would be in a far worse position were it not for the major investments that our cities and local governments around the state of Georgia and across the country have made in recent weeks. Your work is very important. We value what you're doing in response both to the public health crisis and to the economic crisis that stems from these unprecedented events. I welcome your feedback about the survey results, and I'm also interested to hear stories about your experiences with these challenges of navigating the pandemic. You're welcome to give me a call, send me an email, or reach out to me on Twitter. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for your time.
It's that grassroots effort that makes that difference. when there's something that goes on in my town, they're not going to call a legislator. They're going to call their local city council representative, their commissioner, or me as the mayor. They're going to call us.
We'll now hear from Brooks Rainwater, Senior Director and Executive of the National League of Cities Center for City Solution.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brooks Rainwater, the Senior Executive and Director of the Center for City Solutions at NLC. I'm going to talk today about preemption trends and the big picture of what we've been seeing in recent years. To begin, local control is paramount to city governance and city leadership. Overall, local governments have continued to see preemption challenges over the last year, but there has also been an unprecedented counter-preemption trend. There are several reasons why preemption has been on the rise over the past decade. Corporations have been pumping money into state elections to do things like curb minimum wage increases or local regulations of ride-sharing apps. The American Legislative Exchange Council, commonly known as ALEC, has been developing and distributing anti-regulatory pro-industry model bills to state legislators across the country. NLC does not accept the argument that preemption is needed to avoid a patchwork of regulations. Business every day operate in different communities with different tax structures. In 2020, COVID-19, as expected, came to dominate the types of preemption we have seen across the country. As every level of government reacted to the fast-changing dynamics of the pandemic, some states were less cooperative than others with their local governments. Multiple governors in the early stages of the pandemic issued executive orders that explicitly prevented more stringent local stay-at-home orders. Sometimes this started as threats from the state government, such as in Mississippi and in South Carolina, which caused confusion and harmed efforts to flatten the curve. Some states did work with local governments. North Carolina explicitly allowed greater local action, setting a floor or minimum standard that allowed local leaders to tailor policies to their communities. In Arizona, the governor initially preempted local action but amended his order after hearing from mayors in 9 Arizona cities. And this is exactly why the advocacy that everyone does at the local level is so critical. In recent weeks, that preemption has shifted towards harming efforts by communities to reopen strategically and at their own pace. We have seen this taking place in multiple states where cities are responding to the science as they seek to make these decisions on reopening. Before this year, we continued to watch preemption in the business regulation space. These relate to things like minimum wage and paid sick leave becoming especially difficult in the COVID-19 era, and important. After last year, half the states preempted minimum wage, and previous to this year, we were watching growing trends of preemptions in the land use space, as well as with issues as local as plastic bag bans. However, we also noticed a trend of local action against state interference, and a lot of this comes down to the advocacy work being done by state leagues at the state level. In 2019, Colorado successfully repealed its minimum wage preemption. In Arkansas, the state passed a partial repeal of its municipal broadband preemption. While partial, the coalition and the state legislature that passed the amending legislation included spearheading from legislators from rural districts and communities. And through all of this, we are creating resources at NLC's Center for City Solutions to help city leaders out there fight the good fight and change the dynamic on preemption. So in 2019, we released our Restoring City Rights in an Era of Preemption Municipal Action Guide, which outlines 3 strategies local leaders can pursue against state interference. And as will be discussed, we also released, alongside the Local Solutions Support Center, the Principles of Home Rule for the 21st Century, a comprehensive, affirmative vision of what home rule reform to advance local decision-making can look like. And the 4 principles there are local self-governance, local competence, local fiscal stability, and presumption against state preemption. We've also partnered with Temple University to track 12 preempted policy areas, including tax and expenditure limits, inclusionary zoning, and ban the box, and released our first data set last year. As of now, the data focuses on legislative preemptions, but we know the courts have also limited local authority. Finally, and to close, I just want to reiterate that local control leads to the best decision-making for the people in our communities. We should celebrate and uplift the local innovation that is percolating from the ground up. And here at NLC, we will always stand in support of city rights. Thank you very much.
We as leaders, mayors, council members, commissioners, aldermen, however we're listed, this is the voice, our legislators need to be hearing from. Those elected leaders that the people elected to do their bidding.